Listen if you dare.
Something is wrong with my brother. That thought hit me like a slap across the face the morning of October 14th, 3 years ago, standing barefoot in the kitchen at 6:47 a.m. I remember the exact time because the microwave clock was blinking. We'd had a power outage the night before, and I just reset it. The coffee was brewing, the toast was in. Everything was painfully, deceptively normal, except my brother hadn't come home the night before. Now, before you say it, he was 23. Adults don't come home sometimes. I know that. But Marcus had a routine as reliable as the tide. Every Thursday night, he called me on his drive back from the gym. Every Thursday night, he ate the same protein bowl he'd been making since college. Every Thursday night, he was asleep by 10:30 because, in his words, he respected his circadian rhythm like a religion. He hadn't called. His protein bowl was untouched in the fridge. And his bed, I'd checked, feeling ridiculous, feeling like a mother hen. His bed hadn't been slept in. That was my first story, and it didn't end the way I hoped. But before I get into that, before I get into any of it, I want to tell you something, because every single story I'm about to share with you starts the same way mine did, with a feeling. A wrongness you can't quite name. A vibration beneath the surface of an ordinary moment that tells you, quietly and then louder and then screaming, that something has shifted in the world. We are told as adults to rationalize those feelings away. We are told not to be dramatic, not to catastrophize, not to let our imaginations run wild. And more often than not, nothing is wrong. The person we're worried about is fine. They had their phone die. They fell asleep early. They were stuck in traffic. But sometimes, and I need you to hear this, sometimes the feeling is right. These are 6 stories about siblings, about brothers and sisters, about the specific, knotted, ancient kind of love that lives between people who grew up sharing the same walls, the same parents, the same nightmares. These are stories about that love being tested in the darkest ways imaginable. Some of them have survived, some of them haven't, all of them are true. Stay with me. I need to go back to that Thursday morning, to Marcus, to the untouched protein bowl. My name is Rachel. I'm 31 now. I was 28 when this happened, living in the same city as my brother, about 14 minutes away by car. We were close, not in the performative way people mean when they say we're really close, but in the real, boring, everyday way. We texted each other memes. We argued about whose turn it was to call our mom. We went grocery shopping together sometimes just because neither of us liked doing it alone. We were close the way 2 people are close when they've grown up together and decided, as adults, to actually like each other. So when his routine broke, I noticed. I called his cell first. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. I left a message, casual, breezy, "Hey, just checking in, call me when you're up," and went about my morning. By 9 a.m. when he hadn't called back, I tried again, voicemail. Then I tried his landline, because Marcus was the last 23-year-old in America with a landline. Because our dad had a landline and Marcus thought that was extremely cool in an ironic way that had somehow become genuine. No answer. By 10 a.m. I was sitting at my work desk, replying to emails, but my brain was elsewhere. I kept cycling back. Maybe he met someone. Maybe he went out with co-workers. Maybe he left his phone at the gym. All of these were plausible. All of these required zero drama. What wasn't plausible, what I kept pushing down, what kept rising back up, was this. Marcus always had his phone. He was a tech person. His entire professional life existed on that device. He'd once turned the car around at a gas station 40 miles from home because he'd forgotten it on the kitchen counter. He did not leave his phone places. At noon, I called his workplace. His coworker Tyler said Marcus had called in sick that morning, that he'd sounded a little off and said he had a stomach thing. I replayed that in my head, called in sick that morning. Here's what made the back of my neck prickle. Marcus called me when he was sick. He complained about it like it was a competitive sport. He would have called me before he called work, because that was just how he was wired. He would have sent me a miserable little text at minimum, some version of feel like death, send soup. Instead, I had silence, a voicemail box, and a second-hand message delivered through Tyler. I got in my car at 12:15 p.m. His apartment building had a buzzer system. I buzzed. No answer. I buzzed again. Still nothing. I stood on the sidewalk outside his building, trying to decide if I was being insane, if I was constructing a crisis from nothing. If this would become one of those stories I told at holidays to embarrass him. And then your lunatic sister showed up at your apartment like the FBI because you were asleep with your phone on silent. I wanted to be the lunatic sister in that story. I would have given anything to be the lunatic sister. A neighbor let me into the building as he was leaving. I took the stairs to the third floor, knocked on Marcus's door, waited. Knocked again louder, called through the door, Marcus, it's Rachel, I'm going to stand here all day if I have to. A full minute passed, then I heard something. A sound I couldn't immediately identify, a kind of scraping, shuffling. And then his voice, muffled through the door, Ratch, I'm okay. Go home. My first response was relief so immediate and physical it almost buckled my knees. He was there. He was alive. He was talking to me. I almost laughed out loud. But then I stood there and I replayed what he'd just said and I listened to how he'd said it. And something settled in my stomach like cold lead. He didn't say, hey, sorry, I've been sick. He didn't say, I have a stomach bug, I'm gross, don't come in. He said, I'm okay. He said, go home. And there was something about his voice, thin, careful, scraped, that didn't match any version of my brother I'd ever heard. Unlock the door, Marcus. I'm really okay. You don't need to unlock the door. Silence. Then the sound of a deadbolt clicking. I pushed the door open. The apartment was dark, curtains drawn at noon. And Marcus was standing about 3 feet back from the door, in sweatpants and a long-sleeved shirt. Strange, because Marcus ran warm. Complained about being hot, even in winter, and he was holding his left arm slightly away from his body. Hi, he said. He almost smiled. Almost. What happened to your arm? Nothing. I fell at the gym. Show me. Rachel, Marcus, show me your arm. He showed me his arm. There were bruises running up the inside of his forearm in a shape that is, as I have since learned, entirely inconsistent with falling. A shape that is consistent with something grabbing you and not letting go. The story that came out over the next 2 hours, halting, fragmented, full of stops and redirections, was about a man he'd been seeing. Someone he'd met 3 months before and not told me about because things were complicated and he wasn't ready to talk about it. Someone who had, the previous night, become violent. Who had also taken Marcus's phone just for a few days and removed it from his possession entirely. Who had told Marcus that if he told anyone, he would handle things. The called-in sick phone call had been made from his landline with the man in the room. My brother had been standing in that apartment alone and frightened since the previous evening, with no phone, no way to call for help. Trying to figure out how to manage a situation that had already escaped his control. And I had almost gone back home, almost accepted I'm okay through a door, almost been the rational adult who didn't catastrophize. I drove Marcus to the police station that afternoon. The process that followed was long and difficult and imperfect in the way these processes always are. But I want to be clear about one thing. If I had listened to my reasonable adult brain, the one telling me not to overreact, not to be dramatic, not to read too much into a missed phone call, my brother would have spent that night alone in that apartment too. Trust the feeling, that's the lesson. And I know it's easy to say and impossibly hard to define. I know you can't call the police every time your sibling doesn't text back. But there is a difference between the ambient worry of caring about someone and the specific, cold, unreasonable certainty that something is wrong. When you feel that certainty, don't let anyone, including yourself, argue you out of it. My sister disappeared for 11 days when I was 19. I want to say that slowly so it lands properly. 11 days, not 11 hours. 11 days. During which time my parents and I moved through our house like ghosts. During which time I slept 3 hours a night and spent the other 5 lying in the dark doing mental calculations I couldn't stop. During which time I ate approximately 1 meal a day without tasting any of it. My name is Daniel. I'm 28 now. My sister Cara was 17 when this happened, is 26 now, alive and currently living in Portland, and has given me her full permission to share this. She has, in fact, encouraged it. If it helps someone, she said, then say everything. So I will. Cara ran away. That's the basic clinical version of what happened. She ran away from home following a very bad fight with our father, packed a bag, walked out the door on a Tuesday afternoon, and was gone. We didn't know this was the explanation at first. For the first 36 hours, we thought something had happened to her. We thought she'd been taken. We thought the worst kind of worst. The police classified her as a runaway relatively quickly, based on the nature of the fight and the packed bag. That classification matters because it changes how resources are allocated, how urgently people move. A missing child gets one level of response. A runaway gets another. The second level is slower. Less immediate, more weighted toward, she'll come back when she's ready. She came back after 11 days not because she was ready, but because of where she ended up. She had taken a bus 4 hours south to a city where she had an online friend, someone she'd been talking to for about 6 months, someone she knew from a gaming forum. Someone she believed was a 17-year-old boy named Jake. She showed up at the address Jake had given her, which was a house at the end of a residential street. The house was occupied by a man who was not 17, who was not named Jake, who had been building a relationship with my sister with intention and patience for 6 months, brick by careful brick, learning her unhappinesses, her vulnerabilities, her dreams, building himself into exactly the person she needed. She realized within hours of arriving that something was wrong. She was not stupid. She was a 17-year-old girl who had been deceived by an adult who was very practiced at deceiving people. There's a difference. She told me later that the first sign was small, the way he'd looked at her when she came through the door. Something in his eyes that she couldn't name, but that set off every alarm she had. Like he'd won something, she said. Like he'd been waiting, and now the waiting was over. He did not physically restrain her that first night. He was too smart for that. Instead, he was kind, attentive, generous, exactly as he'd been online, exactly as she'd expected. He made her feel safe by being exactly who she'd believed he was, just on the surface. And then, gradually, the surface started to peel. On the third day, he took her phone just to charge it. She never saw it again. On the fifth day, she heard him on his own phone, behind a closed door, speaking to someone she couldn't identify. She caught only pieces, a name that wasn't hers, a price, a timeline. She didn't let herself understand what she was hearing. She told me later she understood it, but couldn't let herself process it fully, because if she processed it fully, she would have to accept what it meant, and she didn't think she could survive accepting what it meant. On the sixth day, she found an unlocked window. She waited until 3 in the morning. She climbed out in her socks because her shoes were downstairs by the front door, and she was afraid the sound of going downstairs would wake him. She ran 3 blocks in her socks to a 24-hour gas station and asked the attendant to call the police. She was home on day 11. Here is what I need to tell you and why Kara wanted me to tell it. In the weeks after she came home, after the police had done what police do with cases like this, after the man in that house had been arrested, after the initial shock had faded into the long, slow work of recovery, in those weeks, Kara and I talked every night. Long conversations, sometimes until 3 or 4 in the morning, working through the shape of what had happened. And one thing she said has never left me. She said, he knew everything about me. Not because I told him too much, because he asked exactly the right questions. He never asked anything big, just small things, favorite color, what I had for lunch, what made me laugh. Tiny, nothing things that added up into a picture of exactly who I was and exactly what I needed. And then he was that thing. He built himself into it. Patience, predatory patience. The willingness to spend months, sometimes years, on a person, to become whatever the person needs, to give so that you can later take. If someone in your life is spending a lot of time talking to a person online that you've never met, that's not automatically a crisis. But it's worth a conversation, worth asking gentle questions, worth paying attention. Kara's door was open because she was unhappy at home, and this man walked through it. The door being open wasn't her fault. The man walking through it wasn't her fault. But I wish I wish so much that someone had known the door was open before he found it. There are warning signs, and then there are the warning signs you don't see until afterwards, when you lay the whole story flat and see it for what it was. My name is Sonia. I'm 44. My younger brother Eli, 39 now, also alive, also okay, also the one who first suggested I share this, was in a relationship for 3 years that I watched from the outside. Increasingly certain that something was deeply, fundamentally wrong, unable to put my finger on what. I want to talk about that uncertainty, about the experience of watching someone you love be slowly, methodically changed by another person, and not being sure, not being able to be sure that you're seeing clearly. Because this is a thing that happens to a lot of people, and the uncertainty itself is a weapon. I didn't understand that until later. Eli met his partner, I'll call him Drew, when Eli was 31. Drew was charming in a way that I noticed immediately and could not quite analyze. Not charming like someone who is at ease and generous. Charming like someone who had studied what charming looked like and reproduced it precisely. There is a difference, but it's hard to articulate, and I've had a lot of people tell me I'm being uncharitable, that I was never going to like anyone Eli dated because I'm overprotective. That I was looking for problems. Maybe they were right. I spent 3 years wondering if they were right. In year 1, I noticed small things. Eli started wearing different clothes, not bad clothes, nice clothes, actually, but different from himself. He started expressing opinions I'd never heard him express before in Drew's specific cadence. He stopped talking about certain friends and eventually stopped seeing them. When I asked about this, he said the friendships had run their course and that Drew helped him see things more clearly. I stored this observation away. Filed it under maybe this is just the natural influence of a partner. In year 2, he moved in with Drew and his calls to me became less frequent. When I pointed this out gently, Eli got defensive in a way that was slightly out of proportion to the observation. He apologized quickly, overcorrected with a flurry of contact for a couple of weeks, and then the contact tapered again. I started checking in more regularly. Eli was fine. He was always fine. He was happy, things were great, Drew was great, he'd never been happier, but his laugh had changed. I know how that sounds, his laugh. It sounds like something a novelist makes up to create atmosphere, but I grew up with this man's laugh. I knew it intimately, this specific, helpless, slightly honking thing that happened when something really caught him off guard. It had been the same since he was a child. And at some point in year 2, it went away. What replaced it was a laugh that came at the right moments, with the right timing, but that didn't travel up to his eyes. His eyes during that laugh were doing something else, something that looked like calculation or management. I stopped being able to reach him. That is the best way I know to describe it. We were still talking, he was still present, but there was a layer of glass between us and I couldn't break through it. Every time I got close to saying something real, asking a real question, expressing a real concern, I felt Drew's presence in the conversation even when Drew wasn't there. A kind of preemptive response, a shaping of the narrative before I could do anything to disrupt it. In year 3, Eli showed up at our mother's birthday dinner with what he told us was a kitchen injury on his cheekbone. Our mother accepted this without question. I sat across the table and watched him laugh his new laugh and talk about things in Drew's vocabulary and touch the side of his face occasionally in a way that seemed unconscious. And I felt something crystallize in my chest that had been forming for 2.5 years. I called him the next morning and I didn't ease into it. I said, "I need to ask you directly and I need you to hear me out before you respond. I need to know if Drew has ever hurt you." Not emotionally, physically hurt you. There was a long silence, and then Eli said, "Why would you ask that? Not no, not of course not, are you crazy? Just why would you ask that?" "Because I love you," I said, "and because I've been watching you for 3 years, and I miss my brother and I don't know where he went." There was another silence. Long enough that I thought he'd hung up, and then I heard him exhale, this specific, complicated exhale, and he said, very quietly, "I don't know how to leave." That was the beginning of the end. A real end, a safe one, a long, hard, non-linear process of extracting himself that took another 4 months and required the help of a domestic violence advocacy organization and a lot of patience on my part when he went back twice before. He left for good. Those returns were not failures. They were part of a process I didn't understand until I educated myself, and I'm grateful I didn't weaponize them into ultimatums. Here is what I want you to know. What I wish someone had told me during those 3 years of uncertainty. The uncertainty is real. You might be wrong. You might be projecting. You might be the overprotective sister who was never going to like anyone he dated. All of those things are possible. But if the uncertainty is persistent, if it doesn't go away when you try to logic it out of existence, if you keep returning to it after months and years, that persistence means something. That's not paranoia, that's pattern recognition. Trust the part of you that keeps bringing it up. I am going to tell you about 4 days in February that I have spent the last 6 years trying to process. My name is Thomas. I'm 37. My younger sister Jess is 34. We are both alive. I want to say that up front because this story has a shape that suggests it might not resolve that way, and I don't want you holding your breath through the whole thing. We are both here, we are both okay, but those 4 days changed the composition of every quiet moment I've had since, in ways I'm still learning to understand. We went to a cabin for a week in February, myself, Jess, and 4 friends. It was a rented property about 2 hours from the nearest town of any real size, deep in the kind of landscape where cell service is theoretical rather than practical. We'd done similar trips before. We liked this kind of thing, Jess especially. She called it resetting. On the second day, 2 of our friends had to leave early due to a family situation. On the third day, a snowstorm rolled in that was significantly more severe than anything the forecast had suggested. By evening, the road out was impassable. By morning, power was out. There were 4 of us left, myself, Jess, and our 2 remaining friends, couple named Ryan and Patricia. We had food for 5 more days, wood for the fire, and a generator that ran for 8 hours before the fuel ran out. This was not ideal, but it was manageable. People live through winters. We had candles, we had blankets, We had each other. The thing that made those 4 days into the specific shape of horror they became was not the storm, it was Ryan. I want to be careful about how I describe what happened because Ryan has never been diagnosed with anything, has never done anything criminally actionable, and has, to my knowledge, lived a normal life since then. What I know is only what I observed. And what I observed during 72 hours of cold and confinement and stress and darkness was a person undergoing some kind of internal event that made him functionally unrecognizable. It started with moods. Ryan became, by day 2 of the storm, hostile in a low-grade way, short-tempered, easily escalated, snapping over small things. This seemed explicable. It was stressful. We were cold. Cabin fever is a real thing. I modeled understanding. By day 3, Patricia came to me privately and said she was frightened. She said Ryan had said things to her the previous night, quietly in their shared room, that she didn't want to repeat exactly, but that had made her feel, in her words, like he was someone I'd never met before. She said he had seemed to calm down by morning and she didn't want to make a situation out of it, but she wanted someone else to know. I told her I'd pay attention. What I paid attention to over the next 24 hours was this. Ryan moved differently. He was quieter than was natural for a normally gregarious person. He watched people rather than engaging with them. At one point, I looked up from the book I was pretending to read and found him staring at Jess with an expression I can only describe as appraising. Like he was thinking something through, like she was a variable in a calculation Jess hadn't noticed, or if she had, she hadn't let on. That night I moved my sleeping bag to the floor outside Jess's room. I told myself it was cold and the heat from her room's fireplace was better. This was not the reason. On the 4th morning, the storm broke. By afternoon, the road was passable. We left. Ryan and Patricia drove separately, and we haven't seen them since, which was a decision made by mutual unspoken agreement in the way those things sometimes are. I never told Jess about the appraising look, about moving my sleeping bag, about the conversation with Patricia. Not until about a year later, when we were talking late one night, and she asked me something I'll never forget. She asked, "Did you ever feel like something almost happened at that cabin?" Almost. That word, I asked her what she meant. She said she didn't know exactly, that she just had a feeling. That a few times during those days, she'd felt the hair rise on her arms for no reason she could identify. That she'd been grateful I was close by, but hadn't known why she was grateful exactly. We sat with that for a while, then I told her, I don't know what almost happened. I don't know what Ryan was working through in those 72 hours or what it would have taken for almost to become did. I only know that I felt something, that Patricia felt something, and that my sister, who had no information and no context, had also felt something separate and instinctive and accurate. The body knows, even when the mind doesn't have the language for it. I lost my brother 16 months ago. I want to be precise about what I mean by lost, because there are different kinds of lost. My brother James is not dead. He is, as far as I know, alive and somewhere in the Pacific Northwest, having last been located by a mutual acquaintance about 7 months ago. He is lost in the sense that I no longer have access to him. In the sense that whatever road he went down it far enough that the version of him who knew me doesn't seem to live there anymore. My name is Cassandra. I'm 33. James is 36. This is the hardest story I will ever tell, which is why I have to tell it. James started following an online community about 3 years ago. I won't name it specifically because I'm not interested in either validating or amplifying it, but it existed in the general category of communities that present themselves as truth-telling, as seeing through the lies, as offering an explanation for why the world feels the way it does and who is responsible for it. These communities are not uncommon. They function in many ways like any community: belonging, language, a shared story that gives life meaning. At first, the changes were subtle. James started using new phrases, started referencing things I didn't have context for, and explaining them to me with the particular patience of someone who has been given privileged information and is generously lowering themselves to share it them. I pushed back gently, and he absorbed it well, argued, but remained himself. This went on for months. Then the community started becoming the primary thing, the main topic, the lens through which everything else was interpreted. My concerns became evidence of manipulation. My questions became proof of exactly the kind of limited thinking he'd been warned about. His old friends, one by one, became people who weren't awake yet. Our parents became sources of the very programming he was liberating himself from. I watched my brother leave incrementally, the way daylight leaves in November, not a single departure, but a slow, accumulating darkness. Each individual degree of change seemed arguable, seeming deniable. Together, they composed a disappearance. I made mistakes. I argued when I should have listened. I got scared and said frightened things that pushed him further into the community, which thrives on exactly that kind of rejection from the outside. I should have found professionals who specialize in this kind of thing earlier than I did. By the time I found them, James had already decided that any professional I'd recommend was compromised. He left, moved across the country to be near people in the community, changed his contact information. We have had 2 conversations since, both short, both strained, both ending in him hanging up. The last thing he said to me in the second conversation was, "I know you think you're trying to help, but everything you were taught to believe about love is designed to keep you in the cage." I have thought about that sentence every single day. I want to tell you what I've learned since, because I've spent 16 months learning everything I can, talking to experts, talking to other families, relationship with my brother was still being invented. Marcus was 20, a sophomore in college, living in a dorm. We were not yet the close adult siblings we would eventually become. We were still in that post-adolescent renegotiation period where two people who shared a childhood are figuring out how to know each other as adults. It was a work in progress. One night in March, at about 11 p.m., I woke up from a dead sleep with my heart going fast and a feeling I can only describe as, something is wrong with Marcus. There was no trigger. No sound, no notification, no dream I could remember. I just came awake out of nowhere, fully alert, with that certainty sitting on my chest like a stone. I lay there for a while trying to decide if I was insane. It was 11 p.m. on a Tuesday. My 20-year-old brother was in his college dorm. He was presumably asleep or studying or doing whatever 20-year-olds do at 11 on a Tuesday. There was no reason to call him. There was no reason for any of this. I called him anyway. It rang twice, then he picked up, and before I could say anything, he said, "How did you know?" He was on a bridge. I need to take a breath before I write the next part. Even now, even 6 years later, he was on a bridge. He had walked there from his dorm, alone, at 11 at night, in March, in the particular darkness that had been building in him for months that he had told no one about. He had been standing there for about 40 minutes. He had been trying to decide something, and then his phone rang. We stayed on the phone for 2 hours. I drove to him 45 minutes, which felt like 1,000 years, talking the whole way, just talking, asking questions, listening. Being present through the small rectangle of a phone connection. By the time I arrived, he was sitting on a bench near the bridge entrance, hugging himself in the cold, and when he saw my car, he started crying with what looked like relief. "I didn't think anyone would notice," he said. "I thought everyone was asleep." I was asleep. I woke up knowing. I have never been able to explain this. I've read about it, the phenomenon of twin studies, the evidence for some kind of emotional attunement between closely bonded individuals. The possibility of nonverbal communication we don't yet have the tools to measure. I don't know if any of that explains what happened on that March night. I don't need it to. The explanation matters less to me than the fact my brother is alive. He got help, real, sustained, professional help, and it was hard, and it took a long time, and it was more his courage than anything I did. The bridge is not where his story ended. But it might have been. In the years since, Marcus and I have talked about that night many times, about how close the margin was, about what it means, if it means anything, that I woke up. He said once, I'd been sending it for weeks, I just didn't know I was sending anything. I guess some of it got through, some of it got through. I don't know how much of this is science, and how much is love, and how much is the specific, ancient bond of shared childhood. I don't know how to bottle it, or replicate it, or turn it into a formula. I just know that the feeling, the one that woke me up, the one that Marcus had been generating for weeks and I had somehow received, was real, was true, was worth following. If you wake up in the middle of the night thinking about someone you love, and the feeling is cold and specific and insistent, follow it. I am begging you. Rationality is a gift, but it has limits. Some forms of communication operate beneath it. Some of the most important information you will ever receive will arrive through channels you can't explain and via means you can't justify. Follow the feeling, 6 stories, 6 siblings, 6 moments where the line between fine and not fine was thinner than anyone knew. I've been thinking about why I wanted to tell these stories, and I think it comes down to this. We live in a culture that pathologizes caring, that treats concern for the people we love as a kind of neurosis to be managed, a failure of rationality and embarrassment. We are trained to talk ourselves out of instinct, to stay in our lane, to not insert ourselves, to respect autonomy and privacy and distance and the right of other adults to handle their own lives. And most of the time, yes, most of the time the person is fine. Most of the time the worry was nothing. Most of the time the right call is to wait and breathe and let people live their lives. But the skills we build from being right most of the time can kill us the times we're right for different reasons. The habit of rationalization can rationalize us right past the moment when action mattered. The commitment to not overreacting can look, in hindsight, like choosing stillness at the exact moment when movement was required. I don't want to make you paranoid. I don't want you to live in a state of constant vigilance about the people you love, white-knuckling through every day. That is not a sustainable or enjoyable way to be alive, and it has its own costs. What I want, what all 6 of us want, I think, having agreed to share these stories with you, is something simpler and more specific. When the feeling comes, the particular, cold, insistent, unreasonable feeling that something is wrong, I want you to take it seriously, not to immediately catastrophize, not to call the police before you've called the person, but to act, to pick up the phone, to get in the car, to knock on the door, to say the uncomfortable thing out loud. The cost of being wrong is minor embarrassment. A story you'll tell for years about the time you showed up at your sister's apartment at midnight because you had a feeling, and she was fine. She was just asleep with her phone on silent. And she teased you about it for 6 months. The cost of being right and not acting is something else entirely. Go knock on the door, say the uncomfortable thing, ask the hard question, follow the feeling. The people you love are worth the awkwardness. They are worth every embarrassment. They are worth all of it. Thank you for being here. Take care of each other out there. And please, keep an eye on your siblings.